Why do so many men remain single for years? Why do even those who seem to have everything the world demands, a good job, a fit body, some stability, end up living in silence, surrounded by screens, knowing the coldness of an empty bed better than the warmth of a real gaze? You might not want to hear this, but the answer has nothing to do with a lack of options, nor with so-called bad luck. The root is much darker, more psychological, more twisted. Men have awakened, and that awakening is what has changed the game forever. Think about it. Entire generations were raised with the myth that romantic love was inevitable, almost guaranteed, that all it took was waiting, trying a bit, showing good intentions. But now you look around, and what you find is an emotional battlefield, a theater where the roles no longer fit. How many times have you silently wondered if you're the problem? How many times have you felt watched, evaluated, that every gesture is a test? And here's what hurts. It's not paranoia, it's reality. The judgment exists, but not in the way you imagine. The modern man lives trapped between two mirrors. In one, the reflection of what he should be, confident, attractive, desired. In the other, the image his mind shows him every night, alone, tired, questioning his own worth. And while that mental clash unfolds, life passes by. Days become weeks, weeks become months, and months become years in which the promises of companionship evaporate. What remains then? The suspicion that the world was never what you were told, the feeling of having woken up in the middle of an empty stage, with the lights on and no audience to applaud. You're not here by chance. You're here because you feel that something doesn't fit, because you suspect that what you've lived isn't a personal mistake, but a collective trap. And I'll be brutally clear, by the end of this video you'll have answers. Not empty promises, not self-help phrases, but a truth that might make you uncomfortable, that might shake you, but that can also set you free. Because if you listen to the end, you'll understand why so many men remain single for years, and you'll discover what this awakening truly means. And here's where the real mystery appears. It's not just about why so many men stay single, but what they do with that solitude. Because the question isn't only why are they alone, but what does that loneliness mean in the mind of a man who is awakened? And I warn you, this point is far more unsettling than you imagine. When a man remains alone for too long, his psychology begins to change in quiet but deep ways. At first, he convinces himself it's temporary, that someone compatible will appear at any moment. Then, as the months pass, his mind starts to build explanations. Sometimes he hides behind the idea that he's too busy, that now just isn't the time. But what happens in the shadows is different. He begins to distrust. Every time he sees a couple on the street, every time he hears someone brag about their conquests, he senses something artificial behind that facade. And that suspicion transforms him. It's not resentment, as many assume. It's clarity. It's as if he suddenly realized he'd been playing a game whose rules were rigged against him. And once he understands, he stops playing. The strange thing is that this withdrawal isn't announced, shouted, or posted online. It's silent. But what happens inside that man's mind is brutal. Suddenly, he begins to see with new eyes. He realizes that most interactions are full of expectations, of invisible tests that don't seek love but control. And in that moment, his solitude stops being a mistake and becomes an unconscious choice. The man no longer chases, no longer begs, no longer exhausts himself. He prefers to remain at a distance rather than step onto a stage where he knows they'll try to mold him. And here's where everything becomes disturbing. When a growing number of men reach that conclusion, the social balance breaks. Think about this. For centuries, Men were taught that their validation came from a woman's acceptance, that their worth was directly tied to to conquer, to build a family, to sustain a role. But what happens when thousands of men realize that contract no longer exists, that no one respects the rules imposed on them? What happens is a silent collapse. And we're witnessing it right now. Relationships that are increasingly fragile, marriages shorter than a phone contract, an entire generation convinced that failure in love is normal. The awakened man faces a dilemma. Either adapt to a game he feels is manipulated, or step away and redefine what freedom means. And the terrifying truth for many is that more and more are choosing the latter. Because freedom, though lonely, weighs less than emotional slavery. And here's what no one dares to admit. The modern man no longer seeks mere company, he seeks truth. A truth he rarely finds in the emotional showcases society has built. That truth isn't comfortable, because it means staring into the eyes of loneliness without fear. It means understanding that the void isn't punishment, but space for reconstruction. Meanwhile, the rest of the world watches in confusion, wondering why more and more men refuse to play the dating, appearances, and forced commitment game. The answer is simple, yet unsettling. They no longer believe in the illusion. They've seen behind the curtain, discovered that the show was smoke, and they refuse to keep clapping. And if you're still here, if you haven't closed this video, it's because you too suspect that the loneliness you carry isn't accidental. That something deeper is pulsing under your skin. A shift in mindset you can't quite explain, but that pushes you to question everything. Don't worry. Stay until the end, because what you're feeling has a name, it has an explanation, and though it may make you uncomfortable now, in the end, you'll understand. And when you do, that discomfort will become your greatest strength. And while men begin to withdraw, something very different happens on the other side. Because if solitude turns men into cold observers, silent analysts, beings awakened from a long dream, women face an unexpected consequence. The mirror they always used stops reflecting. For centuries, the male gaze was the fuel of the game. Approval, desire, constant validation were the foundations of an invisible power few acknowledged but all used. Man, in pursuing, gave meaning to woman's role as the object of attraction, the prize to be won. But when men start to retreat, stop playing, refuse to enter the dynamic, the stage empties. And what remains is an uncomfortable, almost terrifying silence. Suddenly, many women discover that without constant attention, their leverage loses effect. The strategy of indifference, of endless testing, of impossible expectations crumbles when no one is willing to pay the price. The power of absence only works if someone is waiting. And now, thousands of men decide not to wait, not to play. Here arises an unsettling phenomenon. Women surrounded by superficial options, but unable to form solid bonds. Because the same system that taught them to test and discard now condemns them to endless rotation. Relationships that don't last, conquests that don't fulfill, promises that dissolve before they're kept. And meanwhile, they too begin to feel the void. A void they never admit publicly, but that reveals itself in private, when the noise fades and only the mirror remains. The paradox is brutal. Men begin to accept solitude as a space of freedom, while many women discover that the apparent abundance of options is actually the cruelest form of loneliness. Surrounded by suitors yet unable to trust any, receiving superficial attention yet finding no depth. It's a golden cage, a labyrinth where the promise of abundance becomes a sentence. And the darkest part is that, without realizing it, many helped create this very dynamic. They raised the bar so high, they forgot something essential. The higher you place it, the fewer hands can reach it. And now they face a new kind of man, one who doesn't crawl, doesn't beg, who no longer needs to play. The man who chose freedom, though it hurts, is also the one who breaks the script. The result is a social rift that widens each day. Men in silence, rebuilding themselves through solitude. Women trapped in a cycle of endless search. Two worlds once destined to meet, now drifting ever farther apart. And as that distance grows, the question becomes inevitable. What happens when both sides realize they're no longer playing the same game? Stay, because what comes next is even more unsettling. What you're about to discover isn't just an explanation. It's a revelation that will show you why the rules changed and what role you play in this new stage. What happens from here is even more disturbing, because this distance doesn't just affect romantic relationships. It begins to reshape how men and women understand power. And when we speak of power, we don't mean politics or money. We mean the most intimate and dangerous kind, psychological power. Look closely. When a man withdraws from the game, the woman loses a mirror, but also a testing ground. For years, many grew accustomed to measuring their value through male attention, to reinforcing their confidence through constant desire. Now, as that flow begins to fade, a rarely confessed anxiety appears. Because a man's silence isn't just absence, it's a void that forces one to face themselves without. Filters. And seeing oneself without filters is one of the most terrifying experiences there is. This void has produced a curious phenomenon. Women surrounded by shallow options, yet feeling increasingly insecure. Not because no one looks at them, but because they no longer know how to read that look. Before, every male gesture confirmed their power. Now, what they feel is doubt. What does this man really want? Why isn't he chasing? Why doesn't he react to provocation? That disconnect plants a seed of fear, and fear always seeks control. Here a new stage is built, a board where the roles start to reverse. The man who steps aside, who learns to be alone, who retreats into his own growth, becomes something unsettling to many women, because that kind of man is unpredictable, doesn't depend on validation, doesn't respond to old strategies. He's a new player in a game they thought they had mastered. And that unpredictability changes everything. While men discover that solitude is not an enemy but an ally, women begin to feel that this masculine freedom threatens to destabilize what once seemed secure. The script breaks, and what emerges is confusion. It's no coincidence that we now hear more and more about how there are no committed men left. No one wants to marry. No one tries to fall in love. And now that we've made it this far, before we continue, I want to present the following to you. Our book, The Formula of Awakening, is now available. Do you feel like there's something inside you that wants to awaken, but you don't know where to start? Then I invite you to transform your way of thinking, and with it, your way of living. Discover who you can become. Start today. The link to get the ebook is in the first pinned comment of this video. Grab your copy now at a great price. With that said, let's continue with the video. What actually exists is a group of men who stopped investing in a system they felt was rigged, and who now prefer to build their own path. But the most striking consequence is the hidden one. When both sides stop trusting, love becomes a mental battlefield. It's no longer a search for union, but a war of strategies, masks, and silences. The man protects himself behind the armor of independence, the woman behind the illusion of infinite options. And in that clash, no one wins, because distrust becomes the norm. What most don't see is that this fracture is creating a new kind of collective loneliness. A shared solitude, paradoxically massive, yet disguised as independence. You see it on social media, in slogans of solitary pride, in the mantras of, "I don't need anyone to be happy." It's half true, because independence is powerful, yes, but behind that mantra hides an echo that sometimes becomes unbearable. The echo of wanting to be truly understood and finding no one brave enough to take off the mask. And here's the most brutal part. This game of broken mirrors wasn't created by one side alone. Both fed it. But what will define the future is who dares to break the pattern first. Will it be the man who no longer fears solitude and uses it as strength? Or the woman who abandons the strategy of control and chooses to show real vulnerability? One of those two decisions will change the entire board. Stay with me, because we still haven't reached the darkest part. What comes next will show you not just why all this is happening, but where it's leading us. And I warn you, the direction is far more unsettling than you think. Imagine for a moment that this emptiness, this rupture, isn't the end of anything, but the beginning of something new. Because when a system collapses, when the old rules stop working, what remains is an opportunity few know how to recognize. The man who learns to walk alone isn't doomed to isolation. He's being prepared to build a far more authentic bond, but only if he does it from clarity, not from need. And here appears the final key. True strength doesn't lie in rejecting women, nor in hating the dynamics that brought us here. Strength lies in having awakened. Because once you wake up, once you stop falling for the illusion, you are free to choose from a place no one can manipulate. You no longer play out of fear of losing. You play because you want to, because you decide to, because it pleases you. And that, believe me, is what scares the system most. The future of relationships won't be written by desperate men or controlling women, but by those brave enough to look into the mirror without fear, to endure solitude without collapsing, to enter a bond without depending on it. That is the true masculine awakening. Not hiding, not begging, not breaking, but choosing consciously. And that awakening is contagious, because every time one man takes that step, others see that they can too. If you've made it this far, it's not by accident. Your mind is already processing something most don't dare to think. And now I want to challenge you. Write in the comments the phrase, "I no longer play by others' rules." I want to see how far this community of men who've seen the truth and no longer fear saying it out loud can go. Subscribe if you want more content like this, because what's coming next won't be easier to digest. It'll be more brutal, more uncomfortable, and far more revealing. And now I'll say goodbye, but not with a farewell, with a warning. Next time you look in the mirror, ask yourself whether the voice you hear is truly yours, or that of a system that wants to see you chained. Because only when you recognize the difference will you have truly awakened. And believe me, when that happens, you'll never be the same again.